Most people assume that when she walks away from a good man, the story ends with relief. From the outside, it can look like she finally got what she wanted: space, silence, and emotional distance. But what is visible on the surface rarely reflects what is happening underneath. In reality, the immediate aftermath is less about happiness and more about nervous system regulation. The intensity of emotional closeness is gone, and that sudden drop in pressure can feel like comfort. However, this comfort is not the same as emotional peace. It is simply the absence of activation. What makes this stage misunderstood is how quickly the mind builds meaning around it. Distance begins to feel like clarity, and avoidance gets interpreted as strength. But this interpretation is often temporary, shaped more by relief than reflection. As time passes, the emotional landscape starts to shift. The silence that once felt freeing can slowly become unfamiliar. What seemed like a clean break begins to reveal layers that were not visible in the moment of departure. This is where the real internal process begins. Not in the act of leaving, but in what follows, after the noise fades and reality settles in. At first, distance does not feel emotional in the way people assume. It feels physical, as if something tight inside finally loosens. The conversations stop, the expectations fade, and the constant awareness of another person's presence is suddenly gone. That shift can feel like safety, even when nothing about the situation is truly resolved. What is happening in this phase is not emotional clarity, but nervous system regulation. When emotional closeness has been experienced as overwhelming, even if the relationship itself was healthy, the body can still interpret intimacy as pressure. So when that source of intensity is removed, the system reacts with relief. This relief is important to understand. It is not the same as happiness or peace. It is more like stepping out of a loud room into silence. At first, the silence feels comforting simply because the noise has stopped. But silence itself is not the solution. It is just the absence of stimulation. During this stage, the mind often begins to create meaning around that relief. The decision to leave can start to feel justified. Thoughts like, "I needed space," or "this was too much," become easier to believe because the body is no longer in a heightened emotional state. The absence of pressure gets mistaken for confirmation. But underneath that calm surface, nothing has actually been processed yet. The emotional patterns, attachment responses, and internal discomfort that existed during closeness are still present. They are just not being activated in the same way. This is why the relief phase is temporary. It is not the end of emotional experience. It is only the first quiet moment after emotional intensity, before deeper understanding begins to surface. After the initial emotional quiet sets in, the mind does something very natural. It starts to make sense of what just happened. The decision to leave is no longer just an action. It becomes a story that needs structure, logic, and emotional safety. In this stage, the brain begins to organize scattered feelings into clear explanations. The discomfort of uncertainty is replaced with narratives that feel easier to hold. Instead of sitting with mixed emotions, the mind leans toward conclusions that reduce internal tension. This is where self-justification begins to form. The situation is reframed in a way that makes the choice feel protective rather than reactive. Small moments from the relationship may be highlighted differently. Emotional intensity might be interpreted as pressure. Emotional availability might be redefined as neediness. The goal is not accuracy, it is emotional balance. This process is not about deception. It is a psychological attempt to reduce inner conflict. When a decision creates emotional discomfort, the mind naturally tries to restore equilibrium by assigning meaning that feels manageable. During this phase, clarity and bias often overlap. The story being created feels true because it brings relief. It reduces guilt, softens uncertainty, and creates a sense of control over the past. But it is important to understand that this version of reality is shaped by emotional state, not long-term reflection. As this narrative strengthens, it becomes easier to move forward without questioning the deeper reasons behind the choice. The emotional weight is redistributed into explanations that feel safer to carry. However, this stage is not final understanding. it is a transitional layer. It is the mind protecting itself from emotional contradiction before deeper awareness has the chance to surface naturally over time. As time passes and emotional intensity settles, something subtle begins to shift in perception. The mental noise that once surrounded the decision slowly reduces, and in that quiet space, a different kind of awareness starts to emerge. Without the pressure of constant emotional activation, the mind is able to look back with less distortion. What once felt complicated or overwhelming begins to appear more structured and understandable. Patterns that were difficult to recognize in the moment now become easier to see from a distance. This is where emotional clarity begins to surface, not as an immediate realization, but as a gradual unfolding. The absence of conflict allows deeper reflection, and reflection often reveals details that were previously overlooked or minimized. In this stage, an uncomfortable awareness can emerge. The relationship that once felt heavy or confusing may start to appear more stable, more grounded, and more emotionally safe than it was perceived to be at the time of leaving. This contrast creates internal tension because it challenges the original justification for the decision. Alongside this realization comes another thought process, questioning whether the exit was truly about incompatibility or whether it was more about internal emotional capacity at that moment. This does not immediately lead to regret, but it does introduce complexity into the narrative that was previously simplified. Emotional clarity does not rewrite the past, but it does reframe it. It allows space for a more honest understanding of both the relationship and the self. And in that space, what begins to surface is not just reflection on the partner, but reflection on emotional readiness, patterns of avoidance, and the limits of what could be held at that time. As time moves forward, the initial sense of relief that followed the distance begins to change in nature. What once felt light and freeing slowly starts to lose its intensity. The emotional system that was previously settled begins to stir again, but in a quieter and less understandable way. This shift does not happen suddenly. It begins as a subtle restlessness, an internal unease that is difficult to name. The silence that once felt comforting starts to feel unfamiliar. The space that once brought ease now carries a different emotional weight. During this phase, the mind begins to revisit fragments of the past. Not the conflicts or reasons for leaving, but the softer and more grounded moments. Instances where emotional safety was present without pressure. Conversations that felt calm. Presence that felt steady. Consistency that required no effort to understand. These memories do not return in a structured way. They appear unexpectedly, often in quiet moments when the mind is not actively engaged. And with each memory, the contrast becomes more noticeable between what was left behind and what currently exists. This is where inner discomfort begins to form, not as regret in its full sense, but as emotional comparison. The present does not necessarily feel wrong, but it begins to feel different in a way that is harder to ignore. What complicates this stage is that there is no external trigger. Everything appears normal on the surface, yet internally, something feels unsettled. It is the mind recognizing emotional depth that is not easily replicated or replaced. And as these realizations continue to surface, the earlier sense of freedom slowly transforms into reflection, quiet, persistent, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. As new experiences begin to enter her life, they often carry a different emotional texture. On the surface, everything may seem fine: new conversations, new attention, new possibilities. But something subtle is missing beneath it all. The depth that once existed in emotional connection feels harder to find. Without consciously trying to compare, the mind naturally begins to measure contrast. It does not do this in a logical or analytical way. Instead, it happens emotionally, through feeling. Moments that should feel engaging may instead feel slightly flat or disconnected. Interactions that appear normal may lack a sense of emotional grounding that once felt natural. This is where internal comparison begins to form. The mind recalls earlier emotional experiences, not the conflict or the ending, but the sense of safety, understanding, and ease that once existed. Those memories quietly surface in contrast to the present, highlighting differences that are difficult to ignore. What makes this stage complex is that nothing is necessarily wrong in the current moment, yet emotionally, something feels absent. The present experience is not necessarily painful, but it lacks the depth that the mind has previously known. As this contrast becomes more noticeable, subtle emotional reflection begins to develop. It is not immediate regret, but a growing awareness that certain emotional experiences are not easily replicated or replaced.